In the world of air travel, some tickets are simply a means of transportation. But for Danica Thompson, that first-class seat on the SkyLux Airways flight that afternoon wasn't just a place to sit, it was fate's quiet declaration. You belong among those who shape the skies. The atmosphere at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport buzzed as usual. Automatic doors spun relentlessly, suitcase wheels scraped across gleaming stone floors, and farewells were broken by flight announcements echoing from loudspeakers. Amid the bustling crowd moved a black woman, quietly, gently like a breath slipping through the noise. Danica Thompson. No one noticed her. She didn't want them to. Danica wore a simple black suit, buttoned high and neat, with unscuffed leather loafers. On her shoulder rested a soft chestnut leather laptop bag. No brand, no flash. Everything about her was measured, just enough. Just like her. Humble, composed, but unwavering with every step. She walked straight to the check-in counter and handed over her booking code. Originally, her seat was in economy, an intentional choice. But at the very last minute, she changed her mind. She wanted to test the quality of the first-class service, from within through real experience, before officially announcing her ownership stake in SkyLux Airways. The agent glanced at the name on the ticket, Danica Thompson, and gave a polite nod. There's a seat available in first class. Would you like to upgrade? Danica nodded. No explanation offered. The payment was swift. She was given a gold priority tag, and just like that, stepped into the VIP lounge like any other executive. But no one knew. The woman with the freshly upgraded ticket was about to acquire 51% ownership of the airline. Danica didn't need anyone to know. She had no love for flashing cameras or flattery. What she needed was to see the truth, to understand the culture she was about to represent. And more importantly, she needed to know whether someone like her, a quiet, unassuming black woman, would be truly respected in a place touted as the pinnacle of service. Boarding began at 4:20 p.m. Danica calmly lined up at the priority gate. As she boarded the plane, she offered a warm smile to the first attendant, a young Asian man named Jake, who greeted her with a kind voice. Welcome aboard Flight 712 to Los Angeles. She stepped into first class, a tranquil, luxurious space, cream leather seats, light curtains separating it from economy. She chose seat 3A by the window. Placing her bag neatly, she sat down, adjusted the seat back, fastened her seatbelt, and exhaled gently. Everything seemed perfect, until Heather Cole walked in. Tall, blonde hair in a tight bun, uniform tailored to perfection. Heather was the one her colleagues jokingly called the Queen of First Class. She wasn't just the lead flight attendant. She believed this cabin was her personal kingdom. Heather's eyes scanned the cabin, then landed on Danica. A slight furrow of her brow. Then a rehearsed customer service smile appeared. Excuse me, may I see your boarding pass again, please? Danica looked up, her face calm with only a courteous smile. Of course. She handed over her phone, displaying the QR code. Heather looked at it, paused for a few seconds, then handed it back. Ah, yes, all good. The flight will be departing shortly. Everything appeared settled, but Danica could still feel it. That look, that initial frown wasn't accidental. It was a look she'd encountered many times before, suspicion, judgment. As if silently questioning, "Are you sure you belong here?" Danica turned back to the window. Her smile remained, but inside a chill began to spread. And she knew. This was only the beginning. The plane gradually filled up. Business travelers in expensive suits settled into their seats, their carry-ons slipping into the overhead compartments with practiced ease. Danica observed silently. Every movement in first class felt choreographed, from the clinking of glasses on silver trays to the polite laughter exchanged between crew and passengers. She wasn't seeking attention, but attention had already chosen her. Heather Cole moved down the aisle as if inspecting a stage before a performance. When she reached row 3, where Danica was seated, she paused. Not for long, just a few seconds, but her gaze was sharp and cold like a thin blade. No smile, no greeting, not a single indication of service. Danica glanced down at her seat, wondering if she was perhaps off-center. But no, everything was in place, every detail correct. Only she was wrong in Heather's eyes. Moments later, Jake, the young attendant from earlier, approached with a warm smile and offered her a glass of orange juice. "Thank you for flying with SkyLux. If you need anything else, just ring the bell." Danica gave a gentle nod and replied softly, "Thank you. That's very kind of you." She couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between Jake and Heather, and the difference in treatment made that invisible boundary Heather was drawing all the more obvious. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "We'll be taking off in a few minutes. Estimated flight time to Los Angeles is about 4.5 hours. There may be light turbulence at mid-altitude, so please keep your seatbelt fastened when the sign is on." Danica fastened her seatbelt. Her eyes occasionally followed Heather, who continued tending to other passengers as if hosting an elegant gala. A gentle smile for the white man in seat 1A. A light handshake with the blonde woman in 2C. A cheerful inquiry about a business trip with the man in 3B. Danica? Not a word. She sat still, silently, but every fiber of her being was on high alert. She knew this. That expression. She'd seen it in boardrooms where people listened attentively to an idea until they found out it came from a black colleague. She'd heard that oddly emphasized tone when someone asked, "Which department are you in again?" With a suspicious glance. It wasn't loud, it wasn't crude, but it was clear and real. Once the flight reached cruising altitude, Heather began serving the main meal. The scent of warm food filled the cabin as the metal cart rolled softly over the carpet. She stopped at each seat, offered meal choices, even chatted about the weather in Los Angeles or a recent basketball game. When she reached Danica, there was no small talk, just a curt, emotionless question. "What'll it be?" Danica kept her slight smile, an ingrained reflex, a shield built over years. "If possible, I'd like the grilled chicken and a glass of water, thank you." Heather said nothing, no nod, no smile. She turned, fetched the meal, and placed it in front of Danica without a word. No napkin, no neatly placed silverware like she had done for the previous passengers. Danica looked at the tray, then gave a small nod to herself. "I get it," she thought. This wasn't in her head. Heather was deliberately treating her differently. But why? Because she was a black woman? Because she wasn't carrying a Hermes bag, or wearing a Rolex, or flaunting an elite membership card? Or simply because she didn't look like someone Heather believed belonged here? Danica still ate normally, giving away nothing. She took out her phone, switched to offline mode, and opened an internal company report. one that detailed SkyLux's upcoming brand strategy overhaul. She would be the one to approve the final plan next week. The irony hit hard. At this very moment she, the one preparing to reshape the airline service culture, was being disrespected on the very aircraft she was about to own. Suddenly Danica stood up, quietly, without urgency. She intended to use the restroom, but after a few steps Heather immediately blocked her path. "Excuse me," Heather said softly but firmly. "First class should use the front lavatory. You should turn back." Danica paused, surprised. She glanced forward. The front lavatory had a line. "Oh, I thought first class could use either side," she asked gently. Heather pressed her lips. "I just like to keep things orderly, if you don't mind." Danica caught the subtext instantly, and this time the sting of humiliation swept across her cheeks like a cold wind. But she didn't scream. She didn't argue. She didn't react. Just one sentence in her mind. Note it. Remember every detail. Now is not the time. She returned to her seat and sat down, hands slightly trembling. Jake, standing nearby, glanced over with a look of concern. She met his gaze and gave a faint nod, a silent thank you. He understood. No words were needed. Something wrong was happening. Danica sat still, unaware that she had just stepped into something far bigger than a difficult flight. She had entered a cultural battleground, an unspoken judgment on human dignity, and the very beginning of her mission to redefine what it truly means to deliver world-class service. The plane glided smoothly through layers of clouds as soft as silk. The passengers in first class were likely thinking about meetings, dinners, or perhaps just a restful nap in their spacious reclining seats. But Danica Thompson, the woman in seat 3A, could think of nothing but the glances, the withheld words, and the calculated gestures laced with quiet intent. Before her, the meal tray had been cleared, and her seat was slightly reclined. On the surface, everything was routine, but inside, nothing felt right anymore. She no longer felt like a passenger. She felt like a living test case for someone's prejudice. And the most dangerous part was that someone had power. About 20 minutes after the meal, Heather Cole reappeared, this time with the dessert cart. Danica wasn't expecting much. She had grown used to being overlooked. But when the cart stopped right in front of her, Heather glanced down and spoke in a clipped tone. "Ma'am, please sit upright. We're serving dessert." Danica tilted her head slightly, her eyes calmly scanning the cabin. 3 passengers nearby, including a middle-aged man in 3B and an older woman in the row behind, were also reclined comfortably reading or watching movies. No one else had been asked to adjust their seat. Just her. She took a deep breath and slowly brought her seat upright. "Of course," she replied, her voice steady and light, "though I noticed several others still reclined. I was just wondering if there's a policy I missed." Heather flushed, not from embarrassment, but from being questioned. She gripped the handle of the cart tightly and said, "We have service protocols to ensure safety. I'd advise you not to make this difficult." Not to make this difficult. Danica turned to the window. In that moment, her mother's words from graduation day at Harvard echoed vividly in her mind. "You don't need to argue to prove you're right. You just need to know what's wrong. And you don't have to stay silent forever." Less than 10 minutes later, Danica was called again. Heather approached her row, clipboard in hand, and said, "Ma'am, I need to speak with you privately. Please follow me to the galley." Jake from the back of the cabin looked at Danica. his eyes full of concern as if he wanted to say something, but he remained silent, visibly uneasy. Danica stood, adjusted her blazer, and said nothing. She followed Heather to the galley at the front of the aircraft, the space reserved for the cabin crew. The curtain closed behind them. First class fell silent. Heather didn't mince words. "We've received feedback from several passengers that you've been uncooperative and disruptive throughout the flight," she said. Danica stood upright, her voice low but clear. "Feedback from whom? And what specific behavior, if I may ask?" Heather avoided her gaze, her reply clipped and sharp. "There's no need to name names. The fact is, I've been observing as well, and if you continue to disregard our protocols, I'll have to recommend that you be moved to economy. If necessary, we can arrange for removal at the next stop." A wave of fury rose inside Danica, but she kept it contained. She stared at Heather, her eyes sharp and cold. "You're saying that a passenger who's sitting quietly, disturbing no one, breaking no rules, can be removed from first class simply because you feel like it?" Heather took a half step back, not from fear, but from being forced to face the truth. What she was doing couldn't be justified as standard procedure. Danica continued, her voice lower now, but resolute. "I paid for this seat. I've caused no trouble. But if you continue this discrimination, I won't just file a complaint. I'll do much more than that." Heather opened her mouth to respond, but Danica had already turned and walked out of the galley, back to her seat. She could feel eyes following her. The black woman seated behind her leaned forward and whispered, "You all right, baby? That woman's got my blood boiling." Danica offered a soft smile and nodded gently. "Thank you. I'm all right. But maybe not for long." And at that moment Danica knew. She was standing at a crossroads. Stay silent and let it continue? Or speak up, not just for herself, but for the fairness owed to every person who would one day step into first class with a skin color, gender, religion, or background that Heather didn't deem worthy? The truth was, Seat 3A wasn't just a place to sit, it was a symbol. And Danica was about to stand for it. Time seemed to stretch twice as long after the encounter in the galley. It was no longer just a flight. It had become a test of dignity. Danica sat upright, her hands gently clasped together on her lap. She didn't close her eyes. She didn't read the in-flight magazine. She didn't turn on the entertainment screen. She just waited. Waited to see how far Heather Cole would go. And if necessary, she was ready. Jake, the young flight attendant, glanced toward Danica several times as though he wanted to say something, but then lowered his gaze and returned to his duties. He didn't dare intervene publicly. Heather was the lead flight attendant, but it was clear he was uncomfortable. In his eyes, the woman in seat 3A was no troublemaker. The atmosphere in the cabin had started to shift. Some passengers began whispering. The man in 3B, Danica's seatmate, glanced over at her several times as if he wanted to strike up a conversation. An older passenger behind them even rang the call button and softly asked Jake, "What's the name of that blonde flight attendant? I need to file a complaint." Jake looked startled, then leaned down and quietly replied, "Her name is Heather Cole, lead flight attendant." The black woman nodded, pulled out her phone, and began typing notes. Her lips were tight, her eyes full of determination. Less than 15 minutes later, a voice came over the PA system. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We are handling a minor issue in the first-class cabin. If the situation escalates, the flight may need to be diverted for safety. Thank you for your cooperation." A wave of shock rippled through the cabin. Danica froze. A minor issue? A diversion? She bit her lip. Clearly, Heather had reported a false version of events to the crew, and now an official warning had gone out. She was no longer simply being threatened with relocation. Now the entire plane could be rerouted. Because of her? Her, who had done nothing wrong. Who had sat in the seat she paid for. Who had remained silent. Who had been subtly insulted throughout the journey. She, the victim, was now being framed as the problem. Heather stepped forward. The cabin went silent, tense. "Ma'am," she said loud enough for all to hear, "I've received multiple complaints about your non-compliance. I have no choice but to ask you to leave first class and move to economy." Danica stood up slowly, her every motion composed and controlled. She glanced around, the eyes of every passenger were now on her. Some whispered, some sighed. "I'm sorry," Danica began, her voice slightly trembling but firm. "I haven't disturbed anyone, I haven't caused a scene, I'm simply seated where I'm supposed to be, where I paid to be." Heather raised her eyebrows. "This is your final warning. If you don't move, we'll have no choice but to ask the captain to intervene." She had said enough. Danica took a deep breath. She looked into Heather's eyes, not with fear, not with anger, but with the weight of a truth that was about to be set free. She turned, facing the entire first-class cabin. Her voice rang out, steady and clear. "Allow me to clarify something. I'm not just any passenger. My name is Danica Thompson, and I'm about to become the majority shareholder of this airline, SkyLux Airways." First class fell into stunned silence. Jake dropped the towel he was holding. A woman grabbed her phone and began recording. The man in 3B turned to her as if seeing her for the first time. Heather stepped back, her face turning pale. Danica calmly pulled out her phone and opened an email. She turned the screen toward the cabin, displaying the subject line. "Final approval. 51% stake, SkyLux Airways." She scrolled through a chain of executive emails, digital signatures, company logos, every piece of indisputable proof. At the bottom she read aloud, "Effective next week, Ms. Danica Thompson will hold majority voting shares, with full authority over internal operations and personnel evaluations." Heather's mouth fell open. She had no defense, no air of authority left. She was unraveling. I didn't know," Heather stammered, her eyes darting around, desperately searching for an exit. Danica lowered her voice, but every word cut like a blade. "No. You did know. You saw me. And still you chose to disrespect me." No one said a word, but everyone knew. This moment would not be forgotten. Danica returned to her seat. Jake immediately brought her a glass of water, whispering, "I'm sorry, Danica. I truly am." She nodded slightly, then looked out the window. The sky outside remained a calm, endless blue, but within Danica, a storm was waiting to be unleashed, and Heather Cole had made herself its epicenter. When the plane's wheels touched down on the runway at Los Angeles International Airport, soft sighs of relief rippled through the first-class cabin. A few passengers stood too early, only to be reminded by the illuminated seatbelt sign to sit back down. But Danica Thompson, the woman who had shaken the entire cabin less than an hour ago, remained seated, her gaze fixed on the window, bathed in the warm amber light of the setting sun. Outside, baggage trucks were already in position, but inside, the storm within her had not yet passed. Jake lowered his head as he passed by her seat, voice filled with remorse. "Danica, I honestly don't know what to say." She turned to him gently. "You did what was right. No one expects you to be a hero. Just stay kind." Jake nodded, then hurried off to help with the deplaning preparations. Heather stood silently near the door, her face pale, eyes downcast. No more pride, no more power. She had become a living cautionary tale for the very service industry she once took pride in representing. When the seatbelt sign finally turned off, Danica stood. A few passengers gave a soft round of applause, not for the flight, but for the courage they had witnessed. The older woman in row 4 gently touched Danica's shoulder. "Thank you for not staying silent." Danica smiled. No one should have to stay silent anymore. As she passed Heather, she said nothing, but in the glance they exchanged, a quiet message was delivered. "I won't destroy, but I won't tolerate. I will reform." Upon entering the VIP lounge, Danica was greeted by an assistant from the SkyLux LA regional office. "Miss Thompson, we've been notified. Management is on their way to meet you. Are you all right?" Danica nodded. "I'm fine. But our airline isn't. She was escorted to a private room, quiet, with leather chairs and bottles of mineral water. Everything appeared professional, but to Danica, professionalism now had to begin from within, through people, mindset, and behavior. 30 minutes later, the branch manager, Mr. Raymond Clark, and senior HR representative, Ms. Elena Ruiz, entered the room, their expressions somber. Both had already been briefed by Jake and Danica's personal assistant, who had forwarded an email summarizing the incident in flight. Elena spoke first, her voice trembling with disbelief. "We sincerely apologize for what you experienced. This is unacceptable." Raymond continued. "We've already requested Heather Cole be immediately removed from service and disciplinary measures will follow, but we also want to hear directly from you." Danica nodded. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she opened her phone and projected the detailed email she had sent. From that first judgmental glance, to the biased service, to the veiled threats, to the broadcasted warning about diverting the plane, it was all there. No shouting, no accusations, just facts, each line sharp, clear, and cold as steel. After reading, Elena rested her hand on the table and quietly said, "This isn't an isolated incident. This is a systemic failure." Danica nodded. "That's right, and I'm not here to fire a single person. I'm here to fix the entire structure." Raymond raised an eyebrow. Danica continued, her voice calm but firm. "I will request that Heather Cole be suspended, not to punish, but to enroll her in comprehensive training on diversity, equity, and inclusion. If she can't pass, she won't return. I will also implement an anonymous conduct evaluation system, so passengers can report issues without fear of being ignored. And finally, all flight attendants will undergo retraining within 60 days. If we don't have the manpower, I will personally hire new staff." Elena and Raymond exchanged a look. Neither objected. They knew. A new era was beginning. Danica stood and walked to the window, where the Los Angeles sky was descending into dusk. She turned back and spoke slowly. "I don't need applause. I need to hear this. From now on, no one will be judged by the color of their skin or the lack of a logo on their bag." The room fell silent. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed saying had just been said. When Danica stepped out of that meeting room, she didn't feel victorious. She just felt tired. But in that fatigue was a quiet fire, a slow-burning strength. The reform had begun, not with shouting, but with intelligence, dignity, and a business card she never even had to show. 1 week after the incident on Flight 712, a quiet tension gripped the headquarters of SkyLux Airways, a towering glass building beside Atlanta's airport. Rumors of the confrontation between the new shareholder and a veteran flight attendant had spread through every department. Staff whispered by the coffee machines. Flight crews reread every company email with more seriousness than usual. At the center of it all was one name, Danica Thompson. No one saw her as the woman in the wrong seat anymore. She was now the one reshaping the very identity of the airline. On the 12th floor, in a newly renamed space marked Department of Culture and Inclusive Training, Danica and her advisory board began the first session of the airline's reform initiative. On the large screen, the bold headline read, "The Sky Level Campaign, Making Respect a Standard, Not a Privilege." Danica looked around the table. Present were the head of HR, chief of cabin crew, representatives from pilot unions, and the company's legal counsel. She began speaking, calm and measured, because her story alone carried enough weight. A first-class seat doesn't prove who you are, but how you're treated in that seat says everything about how an organization sees people. SkyLux will no longer be a place where someone must prove their identity to be respected. We won't train our staff to spot important passengers. We'll train them to see everyone as important. The room fell silent. Some nodded. Others looked down. But no one objected. That afternoon, in a smaller conference room, Heather Cole was summoned. Not to be yelled at, not to be humiliated, but to face herself. She entered the room, no longer in uniform, but in a plain shirt, her hair down, face pale like someone who hadn't slept in days. Danica sat across from her. Between them was a clear glass panel, not to divide, but to reflect, a reminder that sometimes we see ourselves more clearly when forced to face another. Heather spoke first, her voice hoarse. "I don't have an excuse, but I know I was wrong." Danica didn't interrupt. She let Heather speak, and that was the hardest part, to recount her own actions aloud and truly grasp them. Heather lowered her head. I think I got caught up in the power I thought I had. Every day, watching who stepped into first class, I judged, I assumed. I thought I was just doing my job. But in truth, I was sorting people. You didn't need to raise your voice to shame me. Your silence that day said everything. Danica looked directly at her, not with contempt, but with clarity. Do you believe you deserve forgiveness? Heather paused for several seconds, then replied, No, but I want to make it right. I've already requested to join the training program. I know no one will trust me immediately, but if given the chance, I'll prove myself. One flight at a time, one action at a time. Danica nodded. She didn't need promises. She needed action. I don't need you to bow your head. I need you to lift it with a new perspective, one that doesn't see color or handbag brands but character. You'll be suspended, but I'm also proposing this. You'll be the first to enroll in the Sky Level program, and if you pass with top results, you may return, but not as chief flight attendant. Heather nodded, her eyes welling with tears. Thank you, not for going easy on me, but for not treating me the way I treated you. The following week, the comprehensive reform campaign began. Every SkyLux flight attendant, from new hires to veterans, was required to complete diversity and equity training. An anonymous passenger feedback platform was launched across the system. Internal monitoring stations were established, not for punishment, but to promote growth. Danica didn't rule from a pedestal. She visited airport bases and employee lounges, listening to stories, from single-mother flight attendants to immigrant logistics staff. Every story was recorded, contributing to the foundation of an airline that knows how to listen. And Heather? She started over. Not as a leader, but as a learner. In a classroom among former colleagues, she sat quietly, learning how to say hello with eye contact, how to apologize when doubting a passenger, and most importantly, how to keep prejudice from steering her profession. She had fallen, deeply. But Danica didn't step on her. She handed her a ladder. In an age where anything can become breaking news with just a few clicks, the moment Danica Thompson calmly stood in first class, faced Heather Cole, and said, I own this airline, was no longer a private moment. A passenger in seat 4C, a silver-haired woman with glasses, had quietly recorded the exchange. She hadn't intended to post it until she realized it represented something far greater than a personal conflict. 4 days after the flight, the 58-second clip appeared on a modest account run by the Voices of Justice community, a group dedicated to spotlighting social injustice. No one expected it to spread like wildfire. Within just 24 hours, 1.2 million views. Hashtag #CheerDanicaDeserves respect-topped Twitter. Captions filled the internet. Who knew the woman kicked out of first class was the owner of the airline? When kindness isn't respected, the truth shakes the entire system. Black women don't need to shout to bring change. Danica is proof. The media jumped in swiftly. Forbes front cover, headline, The woman who holds 51% of the stock and 100% of the grace. CNN, MSNBC, The Atlantic, they all covered the incident. Not for clickbait, but to ask a profound question. If this can happen to the largest stakeholder in the airline, what happens to those without power? Danica's office at SkyLux headquarters became a hive of activity, not from chaos, but from a sweeping wave of change that had officially arrived. In a special internal meeting, Danica stood before nearly 200 company representatives, streamed live to branches nationwide. She didn't begin with talk of shares. She didn't mention the video. She simply said, I was a passenger like anyone else, and I was doubted simply because I didn't match the image some people thought was appropriate. She paused, then spoke slowly. I don't need all of America to stand with me. I just need us, the people of SkyLux, to stand for what's right. From there, Danica launched a movement called Altitude of Dignity. The campaign wasn't about redesigning the logo, but about redefining how people are seen. Every new employee was trained not just in technical procedures, but also in recognizing unconscious bias. Open dialogue sessions with passengers were held at major airports, spaces where people could speak honestly about being overlooked, judged, or dismissed. Danica personally wrote a new service declaration, posted in every employee break room. Whether rich or poor, dressed in designer or casual, fluent in English or speaking with an accent, they all share one thing: they are human, and humans deserve to be treated with respect. As for Heather Cole, little was heard from her after the video. Some people expected her to be dragged through the media, publicly shamed, but Danica, as always, chose a different path. She met with Heather in private, handed her a blank sheet of paper with just one question at the top. Do you want to be remembered for your mistake or for how you corrected it? Heather cried. For the first time, not from fear, but because she knew she still had a chance to rebuild. She chose to complete the sky-level training with a perfect score. But she didn't return to her old position. Instead, she applied to become a training supervisor, a role where she now uses her own story to teach others how not to repeat her missteps. Danica emerged from it all, not as a victor, but as someone who dared to stand up and then open the door for others to rise with her. A journalist once asked her during an exclusive interview, "What do you think made your story touch so many people's hearts?" Danica didn't hesitate. Because I'm not the main character. We've all been doubted, dismissed, or pushed aside. But if, just once, we dare to step forward, to speak up, to hold on to our dignity, that's the moment we rewrite the entire narrative. The towering glass headquarters of SkyLux Airways in Chicago gleamed under the late afternoon sun, reflecting golden light like a massive mirror. But today wasn't just another day, it was the annual shareholder meeting. And for the first time in the airline's history, it had drawn not only financial reporters, but also political and social analysts. Not because of profits, not because of market share, but because of one story and the woman at the center of it, Danica Thompson, the woman who just weeks earlier had been asked by a flight attendant to leave first class, the woman who now held more voting power than anyone else in that velvet seat-filled grand hall. Inside the conference room, the atmosphere was taut with expectation. Shareholders, men and women, young and old, fixed their attention on the podium where Danica stepped forward, walking light as air but steady as stone. She adjusted the microphone, a faint static, then silence, and then she spoke. No script, because what she said, she had lived. I know most of you came today to hear about numbers, revenue, costs, market expansion. I used to think the same, but then I realized there's a number you won't find on any balance sheet. One that, if you fail to measure it, your airline will go into free fall. That number is trust. No one in the room spoke. Only Danica's voice filled the space, unapologetic but with the weight of lived experience. I was once asked to leave a seat, not because I was wrong, but because I didn't look like someone who belonged there. I'm not telling this story to gain sympathy. I'm telling it so you understand this can happen to anyone. You don't have to be black, or a woman. Just be different, and you'll know the feeling. Danica pressed a button. The screen behind her lit up with the simple words, "From policy to people, SkyLux's humanized strategy." She continued, "We've spent millions upgrading aircraft, opening new routes, hiring growth consultants. But there's one thing you can't buy with a budget: a passenger's trust. And let me be clear, a service policy rooted in respect isn't just ethically right, it's strategically sound. When passengers feel respected, they return. When employees feel heard, they stay. When a brand can bow its head to learn from failure, the market will look up to us." She presented 3 strategic proposals: a real-time passenger experience tracking system using AI to analyze sentiment from anonymous feedback, the Flight Forward program, allowing employees to submit ideas to improve service culture, earn internal rewards, and apply for regional leadership roles, the Skybridge Scholarship, funding education for underrepresented youth passionate about aviation, helping them access a field long seen as inaccessible. The room echoed with the soft tapping of pens against the table, a silent signal of high-level approval used in place of applause. Danica understood. She had won them over, not with polished promises, but with a truth she had lived. She ended simply, "I'm not standing here because I'm the largest shareholder. I'm standing here because I was once treated like I was the smallest. And I will not let that continue, not under my name, and not under the SkyLux banner. We will rise, but not by engines alone. We will rise by how we treat one another." As she stepped down from the podium, a longtime shareholder, Mr. Raymond Lutz, 73, who had held shares since SkyLux was still a regional carrier, rose slowly to his feet. He said nothing. He simply bowed his head to Danica. A bow. from an old generation offered to the one brave enough to change everything. The next day, headlines weren't sensationalized. Instead, The Atlantic wrote, Danica Thompson. When a woman doesn't choose to scream, she teaches an entire industry to listen. Success doesn't always applaud you, it watches silently to see how you handle resistance. After the historic shareholder meeting at SkyLux, Danica Thompson didn't step out of the conference hall feeling like a victor, but rather like someone who had just lit the fuse of a quiet battlefield. Less than 72 hours after her From Policy to People speech, media outlets reported that 3 rival airlines, including a major international conglomerate, had begun reviewing their internal personnel policies in response to the market's positive reaction to SkyLux's reform. SkyLux shares ticked up modestly, but attention surged dramatically. Analysts began calling it the Danica effect, when a humane act yields measurable economic impact. Yet in the shadow of that recognition, resistance began to stir. On an internal aviation industry forum, an anonymous post by someone calling themselves Senior Flight Ops spread like wildfire. SkyLux is politicizing the service industry. Discrimination happens everywhere, but turning it into a PR tool is dangerous. Danica Thompson's so-called culture of kindness only makes flight attendants afraid of making mistakes, and passengers act like gods. The post racked up over 500 likes from airline employees elsewhere. Some comments dismissed SkyLux's reforms as sentimental, idealistic, and unrealistic under modern service pressures. Danica read it. She wasn't shocked. She'd expected this. She simply told her advisory team, real change doesn't come from a speech. It comes from standing firm in the face of the harshest backlash. A week later, she launched SkyLux's first internal symposium titled Unlearning to Serve. Over 1,200 flight attendants from across the country connected via live stream. Some were curious, some skeptical. Some sat with crossed arms, guarded eyes. Danica knew. These were the frontliners, and if she couldn't reach them, every policy was just paper. She used no slides, no charts. She began with one question. Has anyone here ever been mocked for not speaking perfect English? A few hands rose, tentatively. Has anyone ever been yelled at by a passenger for not being white or skinny or pleasant-looking enough? More hands went up. The room shifted from defensive to seen. If you know what that feels like, then why would we pass that feeling on to someone else just because they're the passenger? Silence. Heavy. Danica stepped closer to the camera. I'm not here to get anyone fired. I'm here to make sure we don't lose what matters most, our humanity and service. The next day, her speech was online, not posted by Danica, but by a moved technician who had recorded it quietly. Within 48 hours, hundreds of flight attendants from other airlines began sharing their stories about discrimination they'd faced, passengers who were unfairly treated, the quiet trauma of being watched by their own teams. From the hashtags Shotger Danica deserves, respect, the internet evolved into we all deserve respect, a small spark, but strong enough to make the skeptics start listening. But the challenge wasn't only internal. In a closed-door meeting with SkyLux executives, a long-serving operations director raised a concern. Danica, we don't doubt your sincerity, but the business pressure is real. If we put kindness before service speed, aren't we at risk of losing customers? Danica smiled calmly and replied, if we lose customers for treating them with respect, then we need to reconsider the kind of customers we're keeping. A pause. The man nodded. He said nothing more. The media dubbed Danica the CEO without a title. But she didn't care for titles. She cared about this. That an Arab-American woman in first class wouldn't be asked to show her ticket 3 times. That a gay male flight attendant wouldn't fear gossip when applying for promotion. That a passenger in seat 32C could feel just as deserving as someone in seat 1A. She knew. She couldn't change everything. But she could start with the very seat she was once told didn't belong to her. One early April morning at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, the place where the storm of Flight 72 had once begun, a very different flight was about to depart. A SkyLux Boeing 787, flight number SLX-001, freshly painted with the new slogan, Respect is First Class, took off on a symbolic route launching SkyLux's brand repositioning journey. In the first-class cabin there were no celebrities, no shareholders, no public officials. Only previously unrecognized guests, Passengers who had once been denied, dismissed, or judged for their language, skin tone, or appearance, now invited as honored guests. They sat in wide leather seats, addressed by their real names and greeted with eyes free from bias. Danica Thompson wasn't on that flight. She chose to remain at headquarters, quietly watching the live feed from the operations center, like a director who doesn't need to take the stage. From the day she stepped off a plane as the woman removed from first class, over a year had passed, and in that time SkyLux had reduced passenger complaints about crew attitude by 38%, increased customer satisfaction scores by 26% in third-party surveys, became the first U.S. airline to earn the Platinum Internal Equity Standard from the National Transportation Council. But more meaningful than the numbers was the shift in energy, one that seeped into every cabin, every baggage handler's grip, every good morning no longer filtered through assumptions about skin color or accent. And through it all, Danica never needed the CEO chair. She never needed a title. She just quietly worked to repair what had been broken. One day, Heather Cole, now a staff training specialist, requested to meet Danica again. In their meeting, Heather didn't bring slides or reports. She placed a single notebook on the table, filled with feedback from flight attendants who had completed the Sky Level program. The last page read, "They say I help them learn to keep their hearts open while working, but I know I'm only giving back the gift you once gave me. A second chance, not based on forgiveness, but on belief that people can become better." Danica nodded. She said nothing. Because some truths need no words. At year's end, SkyLux hosted its first Day of Dignity celebration at headquarters. Over 5,000 employees gathered, not to celebrate KPIs, but to celebrate the feeling of being seen and accepted in their SkyLux uniforms, whether as flight attendants, engineers, or baggage crew. One new flight attendant, Sarah Bennett, who had witnessed the discrimination on that fateful flight, stood on the stage, her voice trembling as she addressed the crowd. "I joined this industry because I love to fly, but I stayed, because for the first time I feel like I truly belong." Down among the audience seats, Danica sat quietly. No heavy makeup, no heels, no VIP badge. But every time someone mentioned the person who changed everything, all eyes turned toward her, not because of power, but because of dignity. At the end of the event, Danica was invited to give the closing speech. She stepped up, not carrying a speech, just wearing a simple bracelet her mother once gave her, etched with the words, "Kill them with kindness." And she said, "We used to think customers were simply people with tickets, but they also carry wounds, memories, fears, and the hope of being seen as human. I don't need anyone to remember my name after today, but if each person in this room can treat a stranger like they are worthy of kindness, even when they've done nothing to prove it, then I believe we're flying in the right direction. Because the greatest airline isn't defined by altitude, but by the depth of our compassion." And when Danica stepped down, the entire room stood. No one told them to. It was simply what happens when someone does the right thing when no one else dares to.